मित्रहो नमस्कार. पुणे इंटरनॅशनल सेंटरमध्ये आपलं स्वागत. We are now ready to begin the program, and may I request all of you to please put your mobile phones on silent. I would now request our guest of honor, Ambassador Sham Saran, to please come on the dais. I would also like to request our distinguished panelists to join him on stage. Mr. Amit Paranspe, the chair for today's program, and Mr. Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary of India. Thank you, sirs. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to all of you. I am Abhay Vaidya, Director PIC. We are indeed honored to have with us Ambassador Sham Saran, Padma Bhushan, former Foreign Secretary of India, to discuss his latest book, How China Sees India and the World, the authoritative account of the India-China relationship. As Ambassador Saran has said in the opening lines of his book, after entering the Foreign Service in 1970, he was assigned to learn Mandarin in Hong Kong. From that point on, he has spent more than 4 decades enriching his understanding of China and is among India's foremost experts on China today. He spent 6 years in China in two stints, in 1974 to 77 during the first phase of the Cultural Revolution, and in 1983-86 during the early years of the economic reforms and liberalization in China. Ambassador Saran has served as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Nuclear Affairs and Climate Change. He is a former chairman of the National Security Advisory Board. He is currently serving as chairman, Research and Information System for Developing Countries, and as a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research. Welcome, sir. The chair for today's event, Mr. Amit Paranspe, is an IT tech entrepreneur, co-founder at Rally Square, rallyscore.com, and a very active member at the PIC. He has worked in manufacturing, retail, and healthcare with special focus on supply chain management and has varied interests across multiple areas. We are also honored to have with us Mr. Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary of India, a trustee at Pune International Center, and an eminent China expert. Mr. Gokhale was there in China during the student protests at Tiananmen Square. PIC has been fortunate to discuss his books, Tiananmen Square, The Making of a Protest, and The Long Game, How China Negotiates with India. Ambassador Saran, I would like to briefly mention that Pune International Center is a multifaceted policy research think tank which works in the areas of national security, energy, environment and climate change, social innovation, science, technology and innovation, and economic reforms and governance. Uh, a number of former diplomats are closely associated with the PIC. Ambassador Gautam Bambawale is one of them, Ambassador Sudhir Devre, Mr. Jaydev Ranade, just to mention a few. Every year, PIC works closely with the Ministry of External Affairs to organize the Asia Economic Dialogue. And very recently, PIC held the National Symposium on the Ukraine crisis and challenges to Indian foreign policy. We are eager to listen to you, sir, and we will now have a small ceremonial release of your book before I hand over the floor to the chair. May we have the books, please? The book is available on sale outside, and I would now like to hand over the chair. Mr. Paranjpe, I would like to hand over the floor to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Abhay. And good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Is there an echo? Okay. Uh, First of all, I would like to say it's my honor to be sitting amidst two of India's foremost foreign policy experts. I would like to thank Ambassador Bombawale for giving me this honor. Uh, I'm going to just ask a very few questions and then hoping that Mr. Gokhale, I'll call him Vijay since he insists, will have the real interesting questions to ask Ambassador Saran. So let me start with a basic introduction or an introductory question to get this started, and then we will get to the real questions. So Ambassador Saran, first of all, it's an excellent book. I finished reading it last week, and it was great learning for me as well, especially the historical parts. A lot of the early learnings about China also came from your books. And so, why this specific book? What was the thought in your mind to write this specific book, especially covering the topics that you've done, given the other books that are out there?
Thank you, Mr. Paranjpe. And may I first of all express my very deep gratitude to the Pune International Center for inviting me to speak this evening. Um, uh, PIC is not a stranger to me. I have been here a number of times before, and I am very much aware of the excellence of this institution. And very happy also because I am associated with a similar institution in New Delhi. I'm president of the India International Center, which was, of course, set up many years ago. So I'm very happy that, on a similar model, perhaps even better than the IISc, the PIC is growing from strength to strength. So thank you very much. I would also like to thank Mr. Paranjpe. Very happy that he has read the entire book. That is not always the case. But thank you so much. And I would like to thank Vijay, my colleague, for being here also as one of the interlocutors. Thank you to Gautam as well for arranging the logistics for my coming here. In the book itself, you would have seen the reason why I thought I should write this book. So let me first of all begin by saying that China is a country which has always been very fascinating to me. So that's very important, because if you want to write about a country or you want to write about a people, that curiosity, that sense of wonder about a civilization, a culture which is as rich as and as long-standing as our own. It is always a very fascinating, exercise. So the first reason why I wrote this book was because I thought that sense of wonder, that sense of fascination that I have for China, is there some way that I can share that with others? Second is that during the long period that I have been associated with China policy, learning about China, I have also found that while there are people in India who are specialists, who have learned the language, like Vijay has, Gautam has, I myself have, there are scholars as well who have learned the language, who have studied China very, very closely in very great depth. The general understanding about China, familiarity with China, even amongst educated Indians, I'm afraid is very, very sparse. So here is a country which today is perhaps the most significant challenge to India. Challenge not in terms of just a threat, but challenge in terms of also an opportunity one can look at. So here is a country which in many ways has become extremely important to India. It is likely that it will become even more important as we go forward. And yet, the general understanding of this country, its history, its culture, is very limited. And I would say, even for people like us, like Vijay and myself, Gautam, uh, I found, at least in my case, perhaps it may be different. They will perhaps talk about their own experience. My experience was that, while we were intensely focused on looking at China from the foreign policy angle, we were looking at China from the security angle, of course, because of the nature of the relationship. Uh, I also felt that you really cannot even do that kind of an exercise, foreign policy exercise or security exercise, unless you put it in the context of this larger picture. Uh, what is there in the culture of China? What is there in its history which drives the behavior that we are dealing with on a day-to-day basis? We are dealing with China all the time, negotiating with China, trying to get the best deal for India. But I think it has been a kind of a shortcoming on the Indian side that we do not really put that exercise in that larger historical and cultural context. By the way, this is also true of China. So what happens? I think both our countries end up with very stereotyped images of each other. And whether you like it or not, that does impact on the manner in which we interact with one another. So part of the reason why I wrote this book also, quite apart from the fact that, as I said, it's a fascinating country and we should learn more about it, is that particular reason. How, at a more general level, amongst educated Indians, some familiarity about China, some curiosity about China could be generated. That's
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And before I hand it over to Vijay, from a process standpoint, we are going to have about 25 to 30 minutes in the end for audience questions. So keep your questions ready, keep them brief. But at the end of 45, 50 minutes of this discussion, I'll be coming back to you. So, Vijay.
Thank you, Amit. So let me begin with a sentence which is quite striking in your book and which has been quoted very often. And I want to just quote it. You say, India is a retreating image in China's rearview mirror. Now, you have, of course, your first assignment in China was when Mao Zedong was still alive. So you have seen everybody from Mao to Xi. Are you of the view that we were always a retreating image in that rear view mirror? Or is it a more recent phenomenon because, as you say, there is an expanding asymmetry of power since the beginning of this century?
Let me put it this way, that even during that early period, the Chinese did not think very much about India. I have described in the book why the Chinese sort of image of India during those early years was, they certainly did not see India in the same league as China. But the reality was that India and China were, at very similar levels of development. In terms of maybe international, shall I say, profile, India was certainly much more active on the international stage that China was. But China, even then, if you look at Mao Zedong's writings, for example, China had a sense of itself, just as we call ourselves a civilizational state. China, even at that time, had a sense of itself as a long-standing civilization, not just a country, but a civilization. But what has happened today is that that sense of being a superior culture, superior civilization, has been married together with very spectacular economic success. Economic success, but also China is emerging today as a front-ranking technological power as well. So what has happened is that over the last, I would say about 20 years or so, when we started more or less at the same level, China, as I've said, has done a 40-year sprint to become the second largest economy of the world. India has not done badly. India too, during the last 20 years, compared to what we were used to before, has also made spectacular progress. But there is no doubt that the asymmetry of power, if you look at any metrics of power, India has steadily fallen behind. There was an exceptional period, short period, when this was not the case. And I have described it in the book that if you take the period, say, from 2002, 2003 to about 2007, when we had the global financial and economic crisis, during that period, even though India was behind China, but India was growing at a much faster rate. The gap between India and China was actually shrinking. And that really expanded our diplomatic space, not only vis-a-vis China, but other countries as well. This is why I always keep arguing that we were able to negotiate the Indo-US nuclear deal precisely because of that very favorable geopolitical moment for India. So during that period, if you see Chinese attitudes toward India, there was a certain degree of healthy respect. There was even when I was negotiating, for example, on climate change, or when I was negotiating on some, international, economic-related issues, the Chinese, in many cases, were ready to, perhaps defer to your leadership, recognizing that you were perhaps much more adept at these kind of negotiations than they were. That changed. In 2007, 2000, two things happened. One, the asymmetry of power between India and China started expanding, unlike the previous period. And also importantly, in the larger geopolitical context, the power gap between US and China, which is its sort of pure power in a sense, that started shrinking. So the impact of both these was precisely what I have said. That they are able to slot India into a more inferior kind of a ranking.
That's interesting. So I presume what you're saying is that the rear view mirror effect is a much more recent phenomenon, and it wasn't from the 60s or 70s or 80s.
We were not a retreating image. We may still have been behind, but perhaps we were not seen. I mean, if in 2003, 2007, we were seen as perhaps coming closer to the Chinese vehicle, as it were, after 2007, 2008, in fact, we started falling behind.
So one more interesting phrase in your book, since we are talking about the book, although after this I'm going to hand over to Amit to come to much more contemporary issues. You say that we all know that China claims it's the center of the world. But you say that a lot of the history about it being the center of the world is, and I quote, contrived history. The fact, however, is that the rest of the world has bought this contrived history, at least until very recent times. So the question I ask you is, given the fact that we are as long and great a civilization as the Chinese are, and we have made as many contributions to the Indo-Pacific that China has, do they have a better discourse power than us? Can they project an image better than us? Can they convince the rest of the world that they are the preeminent civilization and always were, and there is no equal in Asia to them?
Partly, I would acknowledge that they have managed to get across their story, perhaps with greater credibility than we have. I don't know whether we have really tried to suggest to the world that we are at the center of the universe. I don't think we have had such illusions. But I think in the Chinese case, let me take you back to the time when actually I went to China, say 71 or so. If you looked at the Western discourse at that time, it was not that China was the center of the world. In fact, China was this very aggressive country which is trying to gobble up, the Southeast Asian countries. There, the image which was projected about China was a very, very negative image. And this is a backward country. This will never country which will never amount to anything. That was the kind of discourse. 1972, Nixon goes to China. And the geopolitical situation changes dramatically. China becomes an ally against the Soviet Union. Naturally, the Western discourse changed. It was in their interest to project China as being that, superior civilization. You had, people like Kissinger or Nixon himself. What was coming out in those images? As if there was a supplicant going there to pay obeisance to the sage emperor. The same sage emperor who just a few years ago they were accusing of having been responsible for the death of 30 million Chinese in the Great Leap Forward. Or what they had encountered when they fought the Korean War, what they had encountered with the Chinese forces. Very negative images were being. So what I'm saying is that there is an element of both. That the Chinese, of course, always try to put across this image. But what was also very important was that the Western countries, whose discourse power is still very, very, important, very influential. So they very deliberately put this kind of image forward. So you had people, I have mentioned Fairbanks, for example, who almost suggested that, for most of history, the whole of Asia was a cynic world. It was a cynic universe. That was not the case. That was historically not true. So one of the other reasons why I wrote this book was also to try and at least, set the record straight. Is that beginning to change? Perhaps it's slowly beginning to change. But I think to answer your question, both those aspects are important. And by the way, how many Indians have bought into that discourse? That also is something that we should perhaps reflect on.
Thank you. Amit, why don't you take over?
So let me come to, as Vijay had suggested, more contemporary economic issues. And you already started that discussion by talking about the economic growth. And so about 40 years back, our per capita was nearly the same. And now, while we have done not bad, we are up to $2,000. They are over 10,000, nearing $12,000. So they have gone nearly 5x of us, right? So, and because of that, over the last 3-4 years, we have seen a lot of this discussion of China becoming the biggest economy in the world. In fact, there were projections just before COVID that this may happen by 2030 or even earlier. But lately, and I'm just going to pick on a couple of articles from the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg just in the last 3-4 days, things don't look as bright for China from an economic perspective, right? So for example, the Wall Street Journal is saying, this is just 3 days back, the Chinese economy won't overtake now in 2030. And the Bloomberg forecast is saying that the economy is now growing at just 3.5% or expected to grow, which is much lower than the kind of numbers that they were talking about. So what's your assessment of the current economic slowdown? Is it just a blip on the radar for them and their story from 2018-19 continues, or there is something structurally changed in China?
So you would see from recent economic history that countries go through a high growth phase, reach a certain peak, and then it is inevitable that you then settle down to a much more modest rate of growth. And if you see a lot of the American economists, Western economists talk about 2% or 2.5% being the secular rate of growth that you would expect most advanced economies to have. It is structurally not possible to go beyond that. And particularly if at the same time, as it usually happens, your population starts declining as well. Would China be going to the same kind of a level of 2%, 2.5% long-term growth now? I think structurally one would expect that to happen. Of course, the Chinese while acknowledging that, have been saying, but we are different, we have drivers of growth which others do not have. And of course, we have superior management which the others don't have. So there is, I would say that what you are seeing happen today is partly those structural factors coming into play. The declining population, the fact that the kind of productivity growth that is really the secret of any kind of growth. There has been virtually no productivity growth at all in China over the last several years. So those structural factors are very much at work. But in addition to that, there are also short-term factors at work. So you have the debt overhang. If the United States of America had this kind of debt overhang, there would probably be another financial crisis, because you have debt levels which are now something like 300% of GDP. Anywhere else, this would be regarded as crisis situation. The other aspect in China is that, Chinese prosperity is a creature of globalization. This even the Chinese sometimes forget. That the reason why they were able to have that kind of very high growth over a period of time, because the international economic environment was particularly benign during that period. If you recall, the world trade was increasing at 6% per annum. GDP growth was only 3% per annum, right? Then you had, the biggest markets of the world, the US market, the European market, the Japanese market. These were all completely open during that phase because of the Washington Consensus.
They became the factory of the world, essentially.
Right. So even though they had good interest in making China that factory of the world, taking advantage of its much lower, costs, and also the fact that China invested a great deal in modern infrastructure. Let us not minimize the importance of that. But what I think they forget is that the main driver of their growth came precisely because they were connected to the world and had access to those markets. Secondly, what also perhaps is not fully recognized is that China also was able to take great advantage of technology flows from the Western countries, particularly Japan and the United States of America. So some of those drivers of growth are diminishing. And lastly, the private sector in China. So when the space was opened up for private enterprise in China, thanks to Deng Xiaoping's reforms, the private sector in China just took off. And so you had, Alibaba, Baidu, and all these large, Chinese multinationals began to appear. Very dynamic enterprises. Now you see, for ideological reasons, they are under attack because they are being seen as possible centers of threat to the political leadership of the Communist Party. So it is precisely those drivers of growth which are, in a sense, being undermined. Now, it's always difficult to predict, but I would say, certainly say that there is probably no longer a return to high growth rates that we have seen in China of 6%, 7% per annum. That perhaps period is gone. But do not forget that even a 2% increase in GDP of a economy which is $16 trillion or $17 trillion is a huge.
No, I think that's key. I mean, their base is now so large that even if they are at 2 or 3%, they will continue.
We should not be start.
No, I think we should definitely not. Not clap about it. We actually need to study a lot more and study the things that they have gotten right thus far. I had another question and you have answered part of it already. But again, if you go back to the last 20, 30 years when the Chinese tech sector, which was an important driver to this growth, the Alibabas, the Tencents, they were given total freedom. and they were like the Wild West in a sense, the way Silicon Valley has been given freedom in the US over last so many decades. I mean, minimum regulations, they can do whatever, they can build technology, they can sign up customers, and that worked very well for them. And exactly as you said, what we have seen over the last 3-4 years is that has changed completely, for various reasons, for ideological reasons, for other reasons. But so we're basically seeing that from extreme Wild West capitalism, at least I'm talking about the tech sector, we seem to be going to almost like a Soviet-style command and control model of the tech sector in China, where the government wants to control data, government wants to control who can do what and things like that. So is that going to be a big stumbling block for their tech sector potentially? What has worked so well for them?
Well, I would take a more nuanced view. One that certainly the Chinese studied the American model, and it would be fair to say that they also adopted it in terms of creating space for their own private sector. And as I said, they just took off. Now, is that now being completely reversed? No, it is not being completely reversed. There are certain kinds of regulations and controls being put on these enterprises so that the Wild West kind of phenomena is restrained. So you can't really argue against that. Part of the reason why you have a property crisis in China today is precisely because there has been lack of regulation. Now, regulation is being put, but when you are putting regulation, how soon that is sort of imposed? Are you going to give a certain amount of incremental space for this to take hold? This is very difficult to get. So I think what has happened is that a certain degree of anxiety has built up, that if this is not controlled quickly enough, this will blow up in our faces. And I think there is some room for that kind of a sense in China. But what has happened is that this is now being reinforced by the ideological factor. So there are good reasons why there should be regulation, but perhaps they are being further exacerbated, the impact, because of ideological reason. Now, one of the things which you will see, and I think perhaps Vijay and Gautam will bear me out, if you see the debate within China itself, you see this debate taking place. I mean, how far should we go in bringing about this kind of regulation? Because of the fear in the private sector, somebody like Liu He, who's supposed to be the economic czar, actually had to come out publicly with a statement saying, the private sector has been actually the driver of growth in China. They are responsible for 80% of the growth which has been taking place in China. So how can we do without you? A sense of reassurance. But you can see, I mean, it's always very difficult to go into what really is the controversy taking place. But I think there is a fairly, I think, sharp debate which is taking place in China. And it has not yet been resolved. Thanks.
Coming back to the political part, there are a couple of tricky questions. The second one on Tibet, I'm just warning you, sir. The first one is, the 20th century essentially was a Western century where they projected that democracy was the best means of governance for peace, prosperity, welfare, growth. They had defeated monarchies in the First World War, fascism in the Second World War, communism at the end of the Cold War. Now the Chinese are saying that democracy and development are not related. Look at me, I'm not a democracy, but I'm developing better than all of you. And in a post-COVID, post-global financial crisis situation, they feel that their position is vindicated. In this situation, how will they look upon India if we grow at 6 to 7 or 8%? And we show that we are a sustainable, workable democracy. The short question I'm getting at, sir, is are we under threat of subversion from the Chinese side of our political system because they may not be able to tolerate a democracy which is as big in their immediate vicinity?
Well, whether India remains a democracy, I think, rests with the people of India itself. I do not think that somebody from outside can subvert or somebody from outside can promote. So that is something that we ourselves have to decide. Do we value what we have been able to get from being a democracy? That is something which is a fundamental question. Taking into account the fact that there is what I call dictator envy in India, that if only we had, a Xi Jinping like figure, everything would fall into place, which it never does. For the simple reason that I believe one of the reasons why China is able to have something like a fairly strong authoritarian system is partly cultural, historical, because in the Chinese mind, periods of where there has been lack of leadership or the central control over the vastness of China has been limited. Those are the periods where there has been political turmoil, there has been social turmoil, there has been economic distress. It is periods where you have had very strong empires, strong leadership, which are associated with, in fact, peace, harmony, some degree of political or economic prosperity. So there is that kind of a history that is behind it. And secondly, China over a period of time, it started off being a fairly diverse country, ethnically diverse, culturally diverse, but eventually ended up by being a relatively homogeneous country. At least culturally. It is not a ethnic homogeneity, but it's a cultural homogeneity. But of course, they find it very difficult to accommodate Tibet or Xinjiang, because in their mind, this homogeneity is a sine qua non of unity. Now, in India, what I have argued again and again, that whether you like it or not, we are a very, very plural society. Historically, culturally, we are one of the most diverse countries anywhere in the world. And this is what, I have quoted in the book, that Ma Hong's delegation, a sociologist delegation coming to India in the 80s, completely bewildered by India. How does this country actually function? How can it work? They're simply not able to understand because of this huge diversity. How can it possibly be together? But I think one of the greatest assets which India has, at least that's my belief, greatest assets which India has is precisely its plurality. Its ability to handle immense diversity. That is, historically, culturally, that is what you have been good at. And I argue that if you are going to be living in a more globalized world, then those who are able to handle diversity are likely to be more successful global citizens than those who have not. So this is why I'm saying that whether democracy survives in India is really up to us. If we start believing that part of the reason why we are not able to really succeed very much is because we are such a diverse country, we are not able to come together, that's not really the case. I mean, we have an underlying unity that all of us are aware of. As long as we are aware of that, I think we can celebrate diversity rather than regard it as a threat. In China, that is not possible. So this is why I also argue in the book that the future of India is not what China is today. I don't think that we should really be aspiring to that. That's not the model that I would say, certainly. Why China has developed like it has its own drivers. How India will develop and will it develop, the drivers will be mainly Indian, not what comes from outside.
The question on Tibet, sir. We won't go into the history of Tibet, whether the Chinese, it belongs to China or not before 1949 is a matter of historical record. But from 1949, we have consistently acknowledged the control and sovereignty of the People's Republic of China on Tibet. In 1954 with the agreement, subsequently in 1988 when Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi went, subsequently in 2003 when Prime Minister Vajpayee went, each time in a sense tightening the language so as to remove ambiguity. Do you think that the Chinese are satisfied with this situation? If not, do you believe that if we were to meet all their requests, this would still not be a problem in the relationship? Or is it simply symptomatic of a greater concern that India is a challenger and that they need various levers to simply keep us in check, and Tibet is one convenient stick to beat us with?
I would say a bit of both. There is no doubt that Tibet figures very much in the kind of perceptions that China has of India, the kind of calculations China has about India. So if you look at from their point of view, as I mentioned, that the two regions which are not fully integrated, and it is unlikely that they will get integrated even in the coming days, are Xinjiang and Tibet. Now, in the case of Tibet, the additional problem is that somebody like His Holiness the Dalai Lama enjoys a huge amount of reverence even today in Tibet. They have not been able to, erase that. And they are conscious of the fact that they have not been able to erase it. Now, they may believe that this is a perishable problem, that once His Holiness is no longer alive, this problem will resolve itself. My view is that this will be the beginning of their problems. Because it is today, thanks to His Holiness and his kind of policy of restraint, and that violence should be abjured, that in fact there is a certain degree of, restraint over the much more hot-headed younger generation. Younger generation, not only here in India, but younger generation on the other side. And by the way, today, you can't insulate those two. So this is something to watch out for, because it could become an even bigger problem in India-China relations than it is today. That is something that we should keep in mind. So Tibet is very much a part and parcel of that problem. Will this be resolved in any sense if we were to give in to all their demands, which is get rid of the Dalai Lama, get rid of all the Tibetan community here, bring them all back to, we'll want to bring them back to Tibet? I don't think so. My own experience has been that, somehow there is a sense that if something has been conceded, it means that your policy has been correct and therefore you pile on more. That is usually the kind of reaction which one has seen. So the only language which enables you to negotiate successfully is, in fact, closing that gap. So you have to do both things, what we call external balancing and domestic balancing. That is, while you are still weak, you get together with others who have similar concerns as you have. But eventually, it is only by your own development of capabilities, economic capabilities, military capabilities, technological capabilities in today's world, that you can, in fact, begin to influence perceptions on the Chinese side. You said 5 times the size. This is the language I have been hearing from the Chinese over the last few years. Oh, our Indian friends should realize that we are now 5 times your size. Naturally, there will be a difference in the relationship that we have with you. You should be realistic. So this shows how much the relationship gets, influenced by the what is the balance of power. Much more, perhaps, in China's case than perhaps in other countries' case.
Yeah, we have about 5-10 more minutes before I open it for the floor, but going to come back to the technology discussion that you alluded to. You have seen China over 50 years, as you mentioned. You were there in the early 70s, and at least from an outsider perspective, the progress they have made in science and technology, though some would argue a lot of it was initially copied from the West and Japan, but we have to give them some credit that there has been some amount of basic research and R&D that they have done well. They have good universities. Uh, and if we look at the data, the amount of investment that they have done in R&D as a percentage of GDP has significantly been a lot higher. Now it's almost 2.5 to nearing 3 times of what India does. And they have an economy which is 5 times, 6 times bigger. So in effect, they are investing close to 20 times of what we are doing. What is your view of what has worked well in terms of the core science and technology and R&D capabilities of China, and how it has evolved over the last 3-4 decades? And I mean, we always look to the West, the MITs, the Stanfords in the US, and earlier we used to look at Oxford, Cambridge. But is there something that we can learn from our northern neighbor when it comes to science and technology development?
A great deal, I would say. Now, there is no, I think, shame in learning from others, copying. In fact, copying is, as you would know, a very accomplished art in China. I mean, copies of great paintings are almost as great as the original, you know. It doesn't have the same kind of, when you look at a copy, it's not that you somehow devalue it. This is something different actually in China. But let me put it this way. If you look at history, I mean, in a longer term, what you see is knowledge shifting from one center to the other over a period of time. So you have, say, let us start with the Greeks, who had made great advancement in the philosophy, in science. You had Pythagoras, you had Aristotle, you had Plato, you had people who really looked at the world in a very different way from what was the case before. Now, that center of culture and civilization, which was the most advanced at a certain period of time, then that shifted to the Roman Empire. They borrowed very, very heavily from Greece. In fact, the Roman civilization and culture would not have been Roman culture and civilization if they had not borrowed so heavily from the Greeks. Now, if you come to a later period, look at the Arabs, who at one point of time, the center of knowledge, or the knowledge center of the world, was the Arab world. You know, the great centers of knowledge were Baghdad and Damascus. These were the great cities at one time. And what were they doing? They were borrowing from China, they were borrowing knowledge from India, they were borrowing knowledge from Persia. And they very open to borrowing from wherever they could get. You know, look at the kind of translations which were done in Arabic from Sanskrit texts. Okay. Then you have the British. You know, because you had Renaissance. How did Renaissance take place in Europe? The Arabs had rediscovered the Greek texts and Latin texts, translated them into Arabic. And it was this knowledge, particularly in centers like Spain. I mean, it was a great center of knowledge, but this is where, you know, a lot of the sort of discovery of the old Western knowledge, Greek knowledge and Latin language took place. And that began the Western Renaissance, of which, you know, the British were the most successful, inheritors. And then you had the Americans, who also begged, borrowed, and stole in order to become the, foremost power in the world. What have the Chinese done? The Chinese have, as I have said, like a giant sponge, after Deng Xiaoping's reforms, literally absorbed knowledge from wherever they could get. Don't forget that the Cultural Revolution was a 10-year lost generation. So what they have been able to achieve is even more remarkable. So what did they do? They just started, sending their students to Western universities, inviting scientists, inviting technologists from abroad to China to teach, to to also have exchanges with their own scientists. And if you see that even Indian origin scientists in the United States of America, some really very pioneering scientists, some of them were invited to go to China for periods of 5 months, 6 months. You come here to Tsinghua University, do whatever you like. We won't tell you what research you want to do, but all that we want is that 6 or 7 or 8 young Chinese, researchers should just be attached to you to learn from you and to assist you in your research. So like that process of osmosis, you had a whole generation. Many of them actually trained by our Indian, American scientists. The same scientists willing to come to India for nothing at all. We want to just come and, contribute what we have. Not possible. So there is a certain modesty which is required, particularly during a period of your initial growth, where you must be willing to learn from others. You must be willing to be humble and say, yes, I don't know enough, and I should absorb. This, I think, is a very important lesson that India can learn from China.
I think this is very interesting. I think it sort of also fit into the philosophy of Deng Xiaoping that you have described very well in the book of lying low and bide for your time. They were doing the same thing in the science and technology field as well, lying low and absorb, as you said. In fact, from a process standpoint, one could argue that they also copied the process itself of this absorbing science and technology from what the Japanese did in the 19th century, the Meiji Restoration. They sort of took the blueprint and did that 100 years later. And you have referred to...
I mean, this is what I'm saying, that, if you look at history in a somewhat longer perspective, I mean, it's not just a Chinese lesson. It is actually a lesson of a longer period of history. And I think we have not perhaps grasped that lesson as well as we should.
I think so. We have about 5 more minutes, and then we will get to audience questions. So Vijay, any closing questions, comments?
Yeah, one question I have. You have quoted in your book about a speech that Xi Jinping gave in 2017, talking of the new dawn of a new era where the international structure has become increasingly balanced and the general trend has become irreversible. It's a generally optimistic speech that he gave. Of course, he did talk of the US and others in a less than positive sense, but it was quite an optimistic speech. Do you think he still believes this in a post-COVID world, and with the United States now declaring China to be the long-term adversary?
I don't think that the assessment of Western decline has changed. I do think that he believes that it is irreversible. So he talks about we are living through an age where we are changes taking place which we have not seen in a century. It's that kind of a very dramatic change which is taking place, and in that sense the balance of power has now changed irreversibly. So I don't think he believes that somehow the balance of power is coming back to where it was. It's a question of what China is able to make of it. So the kind of optimism and confidence which may have been there 2 years ago after that great victory over the COVID pandemic, and look at the complete disarray and dystopia in the United States and Europe, which reinforce that sense that this is not only is this China's moment, but China has handled these kind of crises far better than the Western countries have. And this coming after the global financial and economic crisis. Remember, I have mentioned there how Wang Qishan tells Hank Paulson that you were our teacher, but no, you are no longer our teacher. You can't teach anything. Look at the mess you have made of your own economy. Now we will be the teachers. We will tell you how to handle. So there was this great sense of confidence that China had somehow found the right kind of balance between capitalist methods, market methods, and in fact a very strong sort of authoritarian system. I do think that that is changing. only in terms of China's level of confidence because of what things are happening in China. And what perhaps their expectations were with regard to, say, the Ukraine war. I mean, they may not have been known about the Ukraine war, but they certainly did believe, like the Russians, that this will be a very short-lived affair. And the West, which is in such total disarray. I mean, Europe is fragmented, Brexit had taken place. Look at the manner in which the Americans had to leave, Afghanistan. They would never be able to mount any kind of a resistance to this. And they were proved wrong. So there is, therefore, I would presume that there would be a certain degree of recalculation of China's China, the kind of challenges that China would be facing going forward. So it's mainly in terms of perhaps a less of a confidence in what China is able to do, rather than looking at the world around being different from what they had thought.
Yeah, I think we'll move to questions. Just one point, sir, on this. As you said, they were surprised on what happened with Ukraine. Similarly, 2 years after the COVID pandemic, they probably are a little bit surprised about their response, because what was thought as the best is now probably coming back and haunting them, with latest news being 60 million citizens still under lockdown.
And the ideological issue there, because having touted this as the great success of the Chinese system, that we are stamping out, the pandemic wherever it appears. Now it is very difficult to back off from that. Having said that, what has been happening there,
Push them themselves into a corner that they can't now.
So coming out of that will then also be a black mark against the big leader himself. That the original judgment that you made was wrong. So they are caught in a bit of a trap. Yeah.
And I think it will be very interesting to see how this particular strategy evolves over the next 6 months. Yeah, I think once again I would like to thank both Ambassador Saran and Vijay for this excellent discussion. We have plenty of time for questions, so please don't rush. We have over 20-25 minutes. Basic ground rules about questions. Ask a very brief question. No talking about your personal views on a particular topic. Tejas or someone here will come to you with a mic. I'll call out some of the people who have already asked questions to me before, so I'm going to take my privilege as the chair and give them 1 or 2 initial opportunities, just couple, and then go over. So let me ask first Air Marshal Bhushan Gokhale, who's also a trustee of Pune International Center, to ask his question.
Good evening, sir. My question is, in the short term or long term, what are the weaknesses of China?
Yeah, sir, that was very enlightening what you shared with us. I'm here, easily visible. So my question is that this narrative of most great big leaders is about making their country great again, and therefore make China great again. It all started. But my question to you is that, and I've read Vijay Gokhale sir's book, where he gives us a great perspective of how from Deng Xiaoping to up till now, how this great story unfolded. You've watched China from Mao up until now. What I want to understand, even in a small organization, behavioral change takes such a long time to take place. How did the Chinese, over a small period of time, convince an entire nation to get a work culture right in order to create such growth? And this is, I'm very curious about, yes, you can do this, yes, you can do that. How did it translate? What were the 3 things you saw that made China great again?
One more question behind Vikram, and then we will...
Thank you, sir, for this thought-provoking discussion. So, assuming by the second half of the 21st century, China becomes the predominant economic power, and its political and diplomatic power also grows concomitantly, how will the world look different? So, to summarize, with special reference to international institutions and international norms, how is the Beijing consensus different from a Washington consensus? Yes.
So weaknesses of China. I think I would say that, and comparing it to India, I would say that China's ability to adjust to the rest of the world, the outside world, is perhaps less than India, because India still continues to be a very cosmopolitan country. So dealing with other cultures, adjusting to other cultures is perhaps not such a big issue for India. You see how successful Indians are in different kinds of countries and cultures. In China, there is still a certain insularity, despite the fact that I've said the globalization that has taken place. There is that innate sort of insularity which is there. Chinese culture is perhaps does not have the same universality which, well, yes, over a period of time, Western culture has got, and I think Indian culture is, comparatively speaking, more universalistic than the Chinese culture is. So if you're looking at China as a global power, uh, it may have the instruments of economic and military power, which are not to be underestimated. But the larger context again, in which it can seek that kind of a global acceptance, perhaps is somewhat less. It may take a longer period of time. So that is something, other things being equal. I'm not looking at perhaps they will slow down very dramatically, or the economy may go into free fall, or that there is in China, political transitions are always very dangerous periods. It's a more brittle kind of a system. In India, political transitions are no longer regarded as being particularly threatening, but in China they are. And particularly when you have even the very minimal sort of institutionalization which was done under Deng Xiaoping, even that has been reversed. So there is a brittleness to the system, and the political system can get shaken very, very badly, and that would have its own impact. So these are imponderables, but one has to keep those in mind. So those I consider to be the weaknesses. With respect to this, was there a massive change in behavior that made this very frenetic growth possible? Let me say this, that I think through a lot of the history, I mean certainly within China, there was a lot of entrepreneurship. After all, even if it was not a great trading power in terms of external trade, its prosperity was very much because of internal exchange. I mean, they were the first people to come up with paper currency. An incipient kind of a banking system existed in China long before you had them in other countries. So this was, even though if it was an insular economy, it was still a relatively developed economy. That we have to concede. So when the sort of political system became more liberal, more open, I think those kind of historically strong kind of attributes amongst the Chinese, that I think was given an opportunity to really sort of blossom and flower out. And this is why I said that attempts to try and to limit that may have the opposite effect. So I wouldn't say that no behavioral change took place. Of course, behavioral change has taken place. Nowadays, behavioral change in societies is taking place at a much faster rate than was the case before. So I don't think China is an exception in that sense. There has been huge changes that have taken place. But during the time that I went to China, for example, in 1983, those were the early years of reform and liberalization. You could see that people were taking Deng Xiaoping's dictum. I don't know whether he actually said it, but it said that he said, to get rich is glorious. And people were taking it very, very seriously indeed. So, I think that sense of entrepreneurship, making a quick buck, was very, very easy to see amongst the Chinese. With regard to, and there is the related question of, my country, my country great. I want to make the U.S. Great again. I want to make China great again. I want to make India great again. One of the reasons why you have a major sort of crisis, a global crisis, I believe, is that we are now living in a world where there are challenges like, say, climate change or the pandemic, which we are still going through. These recognize no national borders. These are completely cross-national in character. Global challenges, true global challenges. And the only way that you can deal with these challenges is through global collaborative effort. So even with respect to, for example, the pandemic, nobody is safe until everyone is safe. That is otherwise, the variants will keep on coming. It is because you have not been able to, as the world itself, been able to actually bring about, large-scale vaccinations across the world. Africa, it is only 6%. So how do you actually stop the spread of the virus? Similarly, climate change. No country by itself can deal with this. So paradox is that precisely at a time when you need less of this my country first, and you need to be able to collaborate together, actually you're going in the reverse direction. Much of the crises that we are facing today is precisely because of that paradox. What would the world look like if the Chinese emerge as the preeminent power in the world? Well, number one, I think preeminence should not be seen as somehow China taking over the world, because even if it becomes number one, it will probably be 20% or maybe 23%, 24% of the global GDP. It doesn't mean that the whole world economy is dominated by China. I don't think that's the case. Secondly, a great deal will depend upon what the reaction to China's predominance is. Are the rest of the world ready to accept Chinese rules of the game? And I think if you look again through history, mostly it is that whenever you have a dominating power emerging, it is almost inevitable that you have countervailing coalitions also emerging. So I think that it will be perhaps not necessarily a completely Chinese world. Don't forget that Western dominance that you see, for example, in the 20th century, as you said, is really the culmination of 500 years of global dominance. It is not something that emerged just in 30 years or 40 years. So even if the West declines, as you have seen with regard to, say, the financial system, still the world's financial system, the banking system, insurance is still dominated by the West. It will take some time for this to decline. So during the last 500 years, there were in fact shifts of power. Centers of great power did shift. May have shifted, for example, from Portugal and Spain to, say, the Netherlands and to Britain. Then later on, it may be shifted to the United States of America. But don't forget that these shifts took place within the same Western idiom. In that sense, it was not such a major break with the past, because it was all happening within the Western system. A shift from that Western system to a completely different kind of a Chinese system, a very different cultural idiom, very different way of looking at the rest of the world. I think that transition will take probably a much longer period of time.
I think
I'm going to get more questions. But for a very brief period, it felt like it was shifting to Japan in the 80s, but that was a very, very short-lived. I'm going to just let one question to Dr. Uday Kulkarni, and then there are a lot of students at the back, so I'm going to get. I hope students have good questions. So after Dr. Uday Kulkarni, we'll get 2-3 questions from students, and then again come back to this side.
It's been a very interesting discussion. Thank you, Ambassador. I was just going to ask a question about the two political systems we have in our two countries, because we see that like the Soviet Union imploded. Can we realistically expect at some point in time that the present Chinese system will implode? And the corollary to that question would be that, do you think Indian democracy some way hampers our growth? And on a personal level, I would like to ask whether the diplomatic community finds it a little difficult to deal with China, especially given the asymmetry in power that we are talking about. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Manish Jadhav. My question is to Vijay ji. Vijay ji have worked. Oh, because he worked in because he worked in Taiwan as well as China. That's the reason why I would like to learn from him what will be the coming dynamics between China and Taiwan.
Student question, yeah, there. Yeah, you give the mic.
Good evening, sir. Sir, I have one quick question. I just wanted to ask how successful the BRI has been in creating its influence in the Eurasia and its expanding influence in the Indo-Pacific as well. One more question I would like to know from you is, how does China see India in the Indo-Pacific and also as a member of the Quad? Thank you.
Okay. We'll take one more question at the back. Okay, here. You have had this question for a while. You can shout out.
All the strong countries and the empires, they believe that aggression is the best defense. Whereas we Indians say that we have never invaded anybody. Is this the mindset that is holding us back? Are we lacking the aggressiveness that China and other empire builders have shown? And is it a God with us?
Okay, so I think we have had 3-4 questions.
Hello, one more question.
So, okay.
Yeah. Comparatively, how far India and China's ancient historical legacy plays a significant role in shaping contemporary foreign strategy, comparatively?
Yeah.
Okay, so aggression. Even countries which indulge in aggression never say that they do. They always accuse somebody else. So I'm not very sure that that is a very good metric, because if you look at Indian history, there have been phases where Indian kingdoms have also been very, very aggressive. You have look at the Chola Empire in the south; they were very aggressive. The internecine warfare which was taking place amongst the Pandyas and the Cholas and the Cheras. So there, if you look at history, there has been quite a lot of aggression and violence in Indian history. So I'm not very sure that the Chinese are that different from Indians. So that is, I think we are perhaps taking very seriously Mahatma Gandhi's non-violence and thinking that this is what Indians are. You will see that in practice, Indians are not like what Gandhiji had imagined us to be. I think he probably espoused non-violence, knowing very well how violent his countrymen were. So I'm not very sure that that is a good metric to decide whether we would have been more successful if we were more aggressive. There have been periods where we have been very aggressive. There are periods where we have not been so aggressive. And the other thing is that how assertive you are should be related to how capable you are. I mean, it is foolhardy to indulge in violence and aggression if you do not have the means to back that up. And I think that is perhaps a much more important consideration rather than whether we are aggressive or not aggressive. With respect to how much history and culture influences current behavior, Well, not mechanically, but there is no doubt that templates of the past do contribute to the prism through which you look at the world. So one of the things that I have tried to do in the book is to precisely provide that kind of. Take, for example, a difference between India and China. In China, spoken language in different parts of China was very, very different. Even today, if you hear somebody talking in Cantonese, even those of us who know Mandarin will not understand at all. It is a completely foreign language. So in different parts of China, the dialects which were spoken, even languages which were spoken, were very, very different. But what was the difference with India was that the script was the same. So even if they were speaking different languages, for a certain historical reason, going back to the Shang dynasty, where these pictograms started being used, which later on became stylized as Chinese characters, the script throughout the larger space of China was the same script. And that was a great factor towards centralization and a certain homogenization which took place over a very long period of time, but it did help. So I have pointed out, for example, that look at the freedom movement in India and the revolutionary movement in China. In India, the freedom movement was an English-speaking elite. And the sort of discovery of India and its ancient past was essentially through the English language. So it was a very much elite-driven movement, which Mahatma Gandhi was able to then make it into a mass movement. But the impulse was a very, limited elite, English-speaking elite. In China, China never became a colony. And the administration of China never fell into foreign hands, except in some of the concessions, foreign concessions. So whatever was the discourse of revolution, or whatever was the discourse of how to deal with the Western challenge, was always carried out in Chinese. So revolutionary literature, because of the same script being there, could be, except for places like Tibet and Xinjiang, could spread very, very quickly across China. Not the case in India. So we must remember, how even in recent times, how that past has been an influence. The second thing is that, again, in terms of language, as I said, the script is the same. You would take Sanskrit. Spoken Sanskrit anywhere in the world is the same, because there are very strict rules of pronunciation, right? There is only one way in which you can recite Sanskrit. So the mantra cannot be a mantra if it is not, it's not articulated in the very, very, according to the very strict rules which are there. So in the old days, whether you were in an Indian court, or whether you were in Myanmar court, or you were in Java, or you were in any of the Southeast Asian countries where Sanskrit was the elite language, the spoken Sanskrit would be the same everywhere. But Sanskrit could be written in Brahmi, in Kharoshthi, in Devanagari, in Siddhi script. So the scripts were different, but the spoken language is the same. Complete reverse of what you see in China. So these kind of cultural differences therefore play a very important role in terms of how we therefore relate to the rest of the world. How do we see the outside world? But as I said, it should not be taken mechanically. It's not as if nothing has changed over the last so many 100 years. Of course, lots of things have changed. But those templates of the past do have a way of reasserting themselves. So this sense of China being the center of the world most Chinese know that they are not the center of the world. But it still influences the manner in which they consider their own place. With the BRI, so the Belt and Road Initiative, how successful it has been, a mixed success. For example, you see what has happened in, say, Sri Lanka. Even the flagship, project, which is the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, all evidence shows that this is probably come a cropper. It's certainly not the model to be shown to the rest of the world. So there have been failures in terms of the huge investment that has been made, and of course it has also been impacted by the pandemic. Many countries it has been slowed down or it has been interrupted because of the influence of the pandemic. So there are difficulties. Where it has been more successful, according to me, is actually in Europe. So if you look at, for example, the infrastructure linkages which have been built across Central Asia, or the ports which they have taken in Europe is far more important than Hambantota. The share that they have in Rotterdam, the Piraeus port in Greece. These are very, very, very critical projects. And those, they have very strong control over. So mixed record maybe, but I would say that perhaps we should look at the European part of the BRI more critically and not just focus on what's happening around us. Also, by the way, I mean, there has been, say, with regard to Sri Lanka, actually the exposure to China is not that much. If you look at it in terms of total debt of Sri Lanka, it's about 10%, maybe 15%. Much of the indebtedness is to is to others. What has happened is that thanks to what Sri Lanka is going through, to some extent unfairly the Chinese are being blamed. You are putting countries into debt trap, which suits us fine in a sense maybe, but that's not not quite the reality. Taiwan, I thought he was going to answer. No? Yeah, so I think, the Taiwan crisis which is taking place right now, to my mind, can be a very dangerous crisis. Partly because it is very sort of mixed up with China's, sense of itself, unfinished business of history. This is something which, China cannot feel whole because one part of its territory has been somehow snatched away from it. So it arouses great emotion in China. So I don't think we should underestimate the kind of emotive power that this has. And in international relations, when emotions come in, then things can go wrong because there could be an accident tomorrow. There could be, because miscalculation on the American side or miscalculation on the Chinese side, it can then set off something which neither side is able to control. So it is, to me, it is a bit of a dangerous situation, whatever be the merits or demerits of the issue. Maybe the Americans think that this is a point of vulnerability and that they can keep pushing. The problem is that you never know what the threshold of pain is until it has been crossed. It's very difficult to actually predict. So I certainly consider this to be something to watch very carefully because it could really blow up in our faces. And a Taiwan confrontation and a clash of arms would be bad for India, no doubt about that. And in terms of the Indo-Pacific, certainly we do not see Taiwan in our calculations as part and parcel of what the Quad should be doing. That is not, as you will see, we have been extremely careful not to let that come into our discourse. The Quad helping us in terms of building up, as I said, that countervailing kind of a coalition, providing a means of restraint on China while we build up our own capabilities, hopefully. That to that extent, it is okay. But to become embroiled in what could become a confrontation between US and China on Taiwan, no, I don't think that is in our interest at all.
Uday's question wasn't. Uday, can you repeat your question?
Which
I think
one?
it was important. Even I am not getting
On this?
Yeah, he
Yeah.
was the first one to ask. Yeah. Yeah, the first.
And whether there's a risk, like in the Soviet Union, the
Okay,
Chinese
okay,
system,
okay.
and the diplomatic community is asymmetry of power.
So partly I answered that by saying that there is a certain brittleness to the Chinese system, which I think India does not have. India there is a certain innate resilience in the system. In the Chinese system may not be as resilient. So I'll give you an example. Vijay has been through Tiananmen 2. I went through Tiananmen 1. Now, in Tiananmen 1, when the similar kind of demonstrations were taking place, we were mixing through the student crowds there some of them were singing the Communist International, some were reading poems about Jiang Qing, condemning her as the evil queen. There was a lot of, it was almost like a festive atmosphere, which was also the case with the later Tiananmen Square incident. Now, even though this was building up, there was hardly any kind of a control being established over this while it was building up, because the leadership was completely divided. So no orders were coming down. There were soldiers, PLA soldiers posted there, there were militia posted there, but there were no instructions. So what could they do? So they just stood there, because you don't act unless you are ordered to act. Something like that may not happen in India. You have systems still, hopefully, that work. But there it is very, very brittle, as I said. So could something like that happen if at the top, because power is so much concentrated at the top, if that itself breaks, it will reverberate through the entire system in a manner that may not happen here. So could that happen? Yes, it could happen. But I also think that over a period of time, even if there is an attempt to try and centralize power once again in one individual, in China also institutions have been built up. It is a much more complex society today than what it was, say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So I also believe that even if there is that attempt, the Chinese system perhaps is today much more difficult to have that kind of complete centralized control as was possible, say, during Mao's time. I don't think that is possible.
So I think we're almost out of time already. I think, Abhay, I'm looking at you. You tell us if we have time or you want to do the closing. Yeah, I think so. We are already past 7:30. So I think I'll hand it over to you. I know there are questions, but they can be taken later via email. We are going to have book signings. Okay. So books are available outside. You can buy them, and Ambassador is happy to sign them here. So with that, let me hand it over to you. Thanks.
On behalf of Pune International Center, I would like to extend a hearty vote of thanks to our chairperson this evening, Mr. Amit Paranspe, who spared time from his busy schedule to grace the occasion. Thank you to our distinguished speakers, Mr. Vijay Gokhale and Ambassador Shyam Saran, for sharing your thoughts. This was truly an engaging discussion. Last but not the least, thank you to Team PIC and our lovely audience for making this event a success. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.